right, I got to pull up my slides here. We are in our series. We're continuing our series, Making Room. We're going to have a couple more conversations about this as we keep going here with this conversation. Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. You have heard it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Many of us celebrated Juneteenth this last Wednesday. And some of our members have a gospel group, a small group that they came up and sang for us, led us in song of Lift Every Voice. It was beautiful. Another event happened in our country on June 19th. The Senate passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on June 19th of that year, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in public facilities. Many opposed this act, including the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who made his position clear when he exclaimed from the Capitol, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. The narrative around the civil rights movement in the U.S. during that 20th century period is often drawn to the stories of Alabama and the 3 marches that happened in 1965. Bloody Sunday, Turnaround Tuesday, and the march from Selma to Montgomery. The first march was just 600 people participating, being led by John Lewis in response to the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was beaten and shot by troopers while he was unarmed and participating in a peaceful voting rights march earlier that year. Governor Wallace forbade the march and ordered the state troopers to do whatever it takes, to take whatever means necessary. Violence broke out against the protesters, and the reporters were ready. The televised news coverage of the police brutality would give 50 million Americans witness to violence being caused by the state on peaceful black protesters who wanted to have their right to vote protected. The second march, Turnaround Tuesday, that occurred just 2 days later, gathered 2,500 protesters and was led by Martin Luther King Jr. John Lewis was recovering from a fractured skull. Later that evening, the Ku Klux Klan members would attack 3 white ministers who had come to participate in the march in solidarity with the black community. Reverend James Reeb of Boston was one of the 3, and he would die from his injuries. Reeb's death would help inspire a 3rd march. A little more than a week later, 8,000 protesters would start marching from Selma to Montgomery, and nearly 25,000 would peacefully enter the Capitol a few days later. The event now being covered by international news outlets. Governor Wallace, under federal pressure, obliged their journey, though personally remaining defiant and hateful. And he was absent upon their arrival. Just 3 years later, King would be assassinated on April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. is a well-known hero in the civil rights movement, and I think obviously a very familiar character for many of us here. Throughout the 60s, he did remarkable things, and his leadership was pioneering in our country. But his leadership started years before this. During the Montgomery bus boycott, about a decade earlier, 1956, King's house was bombed while his wife and children were home, and he was speaking at a church nearby. King rushed home to find his family okay, but his house destroyed, and a crowd quickly gathered around in front of his home, some with weapons, ready to retaliate with violence against the perpetrators of this event, ready to defend and seek revenge for King's family. King would address the crowd. Yeah. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them, love them, and let them know you love them. When Jesus envisioned his followers, it had less to do with private beliefs and much more to do with public faithfulness. That's right. Active apprenticeship of Jesus was meant to be a light to the world, a flavor of Christ, the salt of the earth, allowing others to see their good deeds, their love for others, including their enemies, and their trust in the resurrection, and point others to the reality of God's existence and Christ's love. Making room for enemies, though, has remained the most profound of Christian activities because it goes against all logic and all reason of the laws of retribution, against the rationale of revenge, and against the way of violence and power that runs much of our world. Jesus would teach them what no one had ever embodied: enemy love. Forgive them, Father, for they don't know what they're doing, would be his prayer for those who were physically nailing him to the cross. In an ultimate act of self-offering love, he would lay down his life in submission to a system of violence and corruption in order to reconcile all things to God, and to shame the powers and the rulers of the age with their inhumane treatment of others. Jesus was not a pacifist, though. He was active in all ways, fighting with love against the evils of humanity. And he called us, if we should assume ourselves to be his followers, to do the same, to make room for our enemies, and to fight with love. So, what does making room for our enemies in the way of Jesus look like? Let's consider a few things from this teaching of Jesus. And just so you're keen to it, there's a great podcast called The Bible Project, if you're not familiar with it. Tim Mackey unpacks this passage, way better than I am. I'm just kind of gleaning some of the insights and teaching from that. But you should check it out for yourself. But Matthew 5, let's just take the first statement. You've heard it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. How's that sit with you? You go, do not resist? I don't like that at all. Scholars of the Greek agree that based on the language that Matthew is using for Jesus' teaching, this is almost certainly a play on words. An eye for an eye and resist, or to not resist, they actually have a word in common. And the word in Greek is anti. Can you all say that? Anti. We're all speaking Greek this morning, guys. It's amazing. And Jesus uses that word anti when he says an eye for an eye, or eye anti-eye. It means like in place of the thing that matches it. Does that make sense? And then he uses that root word again to say, don't resist an evil person. Anthisteme, which I'm not a Greek scholar, but that's the best I can do with the pronunciation. But it's literally, he's using that same word to say, don't stand against an evil person in the way that they're standing against you. Don't eye for an eye. Don't anti them. Does that make sense? So this is not a teaching of just be a doormat and don't ever resist. It's saying, no, don't resist in the same way. Right. Don't eye for an eye them. Don't oppose them back with evil. Paul would pick this up later on and kind of rework, and he would just say, hey, don't repay evil for evil, 1 Thessalonians 5, right? Jesus goes on to give us lots of practicals about this approach to fighting with love. First thing he says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Okay, I need a volunteer. Frank's hand went up really fast, a little too fast, but go ahead, Frank, come on up here for a second. Oh, Frank told me right before church started, he goes, we need to get some time. Maybe this is what it's about. I don't know. All right, so Frank, you're right-handed?
Yes.
Okay, so if I'm going to turn my, please don't hit me, though. But if you do, I'm going to try to follow the teachings of Jesus here. But I'm going to turn my right cheek to you. So if you're going to hit me with your right hand, how would you have to hit me?
Backhand.
Okay, let's just slow-mo that, okay? Just slow-mo. Boom. So he's backhanded me. Now, scholars agree that if you were to backhand someone in a honor-shame society, in a socially stratified society, right, where your place was under someone else, you could only backhand somebody who was lower than you in class. So to backhand somebody was to say, you are beneath me, get in place. Does that make sense? Now, if he's backhanded me, what's he saying to me? You're beneath me.
Yeah.
Now, okay, I turn the left cheek to you. Now, which way do you have to hit me? With an open hand, right? An open-handed slap was only meant for peers. So you would never backhand a peer socially. So in essence, what's happening here in this teaching is the offender is saying, you're beneath me. And the follower of Jesus is turning the cheek and saying, actually, we're equal. Isn't that amazing? So he's resisting in a very different way, in an act of love. And what would happen in that moment? You can imagine the pause, right? If you're there witnessing a slap like that, right? And then you know the social implications of the front, backhand, and forehand, and somebody suddenly turns the other cheek and gives them an opportunity now to treat you as an equal. The question marks that would come up for both the person who hit them and everybody else. Why do we see each other this way? What are we trying to say about one another? And you're forcing them to wrestle with this question and recognize, hey, we are both children of God. That's some Jesus jujitsu right there. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, that's some stuff. Thanks, Frank. You can have a seat. Frank was really hoping to hit me, but if you're going to hit me, you're going to have to acknowledge that I'm your equal. I'm not beneath you. And the inverse is true. You're not beneath me.
Yeah. Amen.
That's a powerful message. Second practical he gives. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Suing someone, there was made room for that in the law. But if you sued somebody, you could only sue them for their coat, not their shirt. Because people typically only had one or maybe two pieces of clothing, garments to wear. So you could sue them for their coat, but you know what happened at the end of the day when it got cold at night? You had to give them their coat back at the end of the day, and then they had to give it back to you the next morning. Oh, wow. So, but Jesus doesn't say, hey, if someone sues you for your coat, what does he say? He says, if someone sues you for your shirt, meaning somebody goes above and beyond what they're legally able to do and uses abusive power to take from you what doesn't even rightfully belong to them in a reconciliation situation. He says, give them your coat too. So you don't even have like the coat to cover up. So now, imagine you're there, this is happening probably publicly in a small town or maybe in front of people, in front of the people who would enforce the law. They take your shirt and then you take off your coat and you give them your coat as well. And now, how are you standing? Naked, basically. All right, I need a volunteer for this one. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that. I don't want to see anybody's hands go up on that one. But it's forcing everyone around them to see how that person is treating you. Jesus is saying, basically, go for shock value. Like, get their attention. Go above and beyond through generosity to subvert the power that they're trying to have over you. Okay, last one here. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. By law, the Romans could force Jews, because they were subject to them, it was a Roman occupation, to carry their stuff, heavy stuff, up to 1 mile. They could take you away from whatever you're doing. You're spending time with your family, you're in the middle of a job, whatever is happening for you, they could say, hey, right now, you're going to take my pack and my sword and my shield, and you're going to follow me for the next mile. And you had to do it. Otherwise, you'd face some serious violence against you. But they could only go 1 mile. And so Jesus says, after that 1 mile, go with them another mile. Okay, what does this do? You're no longer obeying the law. You've now transgressed the parameters of what is legally expected of you. And you're going above and beyond. You're no longer in this power dynamic of, I have the right to tell you to do what I need you to do. You're now saying, I'm going to offer you that help. And so it forces this relationship into a new dynamic of, I'm here to help you. You're redefining the relationship by going this extra mile. You're saying, I love other human beings. They talk about this in the podcast, but who helps you move? Like if you had to physically move, who would show up to help you move? Your family, your friends. So you're taking this abusive, authoritative relationship and you're flipping it. And you're saying, no, we're actually friends. Again, some pretty wild Jesus jiu-jitsu stuff right there. Most of what has been taught, though, thus far is dealing with kind of oppressive adversaries, those who are being unjust towards you, towards a group of people. And some of us have been in those situations in the past. Some of us will find ourselves there at some point in our lives. But these are moments of overt injustice. And Jesus teaches us to creatively act with love and the agenda of reconciliation and pointing other people towards God. But what about us? Because we're not occupied by Rome. Nobody's forcing us to go 2 miles right now. Jesus goes on and talks about other types of enemies. He says, you have heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the pagans and the tax collectors doing that? And if not even the tax collectors doing that, and if you greet only your own people, what more are you doing than others? Don't even pagans do that? Be what? Perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So he moves the conversation from kind of this oppressors to people who just treat you unrighteously. Those who persecute you or say things about you that aren't true. Those who are just not your kind of people. Like they're not your ethnicity or race or culture or politics, or they don't share your allegiances about things. Those kind of people. None of us will live under Roman rule, likely, right? Like that's probably not going to happen again. Some of us will have suffered under oppressive systems of power. But all of us will run into these kind of enemies. It's quiet in here. The neighbor who called the HOA on you. The boss who gossiped about you. Your kid's teacher. Your spouse at times. Family members. The stranger in traffic. Do you know what I'm talking about? What will it mean to make room for our enemies, to fight with love? Jesus gives one very broad, practical, and 2 very specific ones. He says, first, love them. Not feel love for them, by the way, but actually love them with actions. James would say, I will show you my faith by my what? deeds. Yes, John, the earliest, one of the earliest apostles and the longest to live, would write to the church, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. He had been formed into a person of love for his enemies. If you know the start of John's life, him and his brother, they're like, hey, let's burn the city down. They don't like us, let's burn the city down, right? But by the end of his life, he had been so formed by the way of Jesus that his whole message, read 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, it's just, children, learn to love. If you don't love, you're not from God. Like a very different posture on things. But it's action. Not just flattering them with encouraging words. Taking a loving action towards them to make room for them. He says, do something. What are you doing more than others? I think a lot of times in our culture, we settle for, I'm just going to have really good, this person's wronged me, I'm going to just try to have good intentions towards them. I'll say some nice things about them publicly and maybe even to their face, and we'll just try to smooth things over, right? He's saying, no, don't just flatter with encouraging words. Take action. Do something. Perhaps, maybe invite them to dinner. Have a meal with them. We've been talking a lot about hospitality over the last couple of months. But an active, embodied care, not just good intentions. And this is where we struggled. We struggle, right? We have, I think, too often watered down this teaching and allowed it to become just avoid the person. Like, just don't get back into any, just try to be loving and say the right Christian things to the person, right? Or just being more encouraging or whatever. But he says, no, what are you doing? Not what are you saying? What are you doing? And when we do that, when we take action, something different happens. But when we don't, reconciliation doesn't happen. When there's not action, when there's just nice words, when there's just good intentions or trying to smooth things over, reconciliation doesn't actually happen. And instead, what happens is when it comes up again, because guess what? It's going to come up again. Whatever it is you're avoiding, when it comes, now it feels doubly hard. You feel even stronger about it. Because you didn't reconcile with active love the last time. Are you with me right there? A lot of us remember 2018, Botham Jean was murdered by an off-duty police officer while sitting in his home. He was a Church of Christ brother, song leader in Dallas. And a lot of us remember the trial and this powerful moment when his brother Brandt, during the trial, tells the officer who had killed his brother, I love you as a person, and I don't wish anything bad on you. But then something extraordinary happened. He got up and gave her a hug. That's doing something. Are you with me right there? Taking action. Fight with love. Jim Wilder, who's a clinical psychologist and theology seminary professor, he wrote a book called Escaping Enemy Mode. Escaping Enemy Mode. And what they talk about is basically the state of our brain, right, is such that we all have this little thing that triggers us into what he calls enemy mode. And it's in that state, it's a really unhealthy state to be in. It's not the deferred state that we're supposed to, the default state that we're supposed to be in. But it's a state we all get to. It's called enemy mode. It's unhealthy, but it's there to signal we're in danger. Now, none of us are running from saber-toothed tigers anymore or whatever it is, right? That was mechanically there for us at some point in our history, but it still shows up for us. And a lot of us have mental maps from our own upbringing and traumas and past and whatever that still inform our relationships today, and we go into enemy mode very quick. And there's 3 simple levels to enemy mode. One is You're just not interested in the person. Like you just go, I just want to avoid you. I'm kind of annoyed by you right now. I'm a little irritated, right? It's low level, but you just don't want to talk. You don't want to see them. You see them in fellowship, you go the other way, right? They walk through your house in the morning and you're like, oh, you know what I mean? Like you just don't want to talk. You don't want to see them. You're cold to them. You're in enemy mode. Then there's level 2. They call this stupid enemy mode. And it's essentially when your brain, your cognitive and emotional functioning is significantly impaired due to your perception of others as enemies. So this could be, again, brought up or triggered from other things in the past, but you're responding disproportionately to what's happening. You're impulsive, meaning you're acting without thinking. There's rage, there's contempt. Everyone is stupid at this point. Like you're just like, you're stupid and that person's stupid and nobody gets, have you ever been there? I certainly have. You're feeling intentionally opposed. You're suspicious and paranoia. It abounds, right? You're quick to point out flaws in other people. You're out of control emotionally. Picture the protest lines and 2 people on each side and the screaming and the pointing and the drooling and like, you know what I'm talking about? You're in that place. This is you screaming at your spouse or your children. This is you verbally attacking people on the other side of the political aisle. This is tunnel vision. This is seeing others as a threat to your identity. Wow. Enemy mode. And then there's level 3. They call this intelligent enemy mode. It's the severe level. This is in high stakes or competitive environments. So there's this intense focus on winning. And winning at all costs. There's a lack of empathy. There's an us versus them competition happening. This is close to what our politics in the U.S. looks like on the far ends. Are you with me? Yes. There's this desire to cause them harm somehow, if not physical, some other way, to exploit their weaknesses. It's very strategic. It's manipulative. We feel justified in hating them, though we would never call it hate out loud. There's a deep-seated anger and resentment and animosity. This is essentially how social media makes most of its money. Yes. And how the talking heads know the game works. Yes. Black Lives Matter, MAGA, trans athletes, vaccines. Oddly enough, this last week, Dolly Parton. These words send people into enemy mode. Yes. Do you know what I'm talking about? Some of you right now are like, I'm about to get to enemy mode. Say it one more time, right? Whatever it is, right? Words alone have enough power to create the enemy mode for you, but they don't have enough. Words do not have enough power to get you out of enemy mode. And this is important. Actually, in your brain cannot get out of enemy mode with just words. That's why when somebody's feeling it and you try to rationally explain to them why they shouldn't feel it, and here's the statistics about why you shouldn't feel how you feel, it doesn't work, right? Words get you into enemy mode, but they can't get you out. You need something else. How do we solve it? Well, the science would say you have to humanize the person. Learn their story. Empathy comes through listening to others' stories. Jesus would say, greet them. Just say hello. Say good morning. Humanize them again. They are not this enemy, right? Humanize them. Say hello. Ask questions about where they come from. Make room to get to know them. Find out their journey. Do you know what deflates enemy narratives? Stories about them being as you are. Stories about them being a father like you're a father, or a son like you're a son, or a citizen like you're a citizen. Suffering, overcoming, learning. You can't love someone as you love yourself without getting to know them. It takes action. This is why we have that saying, and it's a good saying, like if you can see them, they're not your enemy. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's a nice saying because it kind of points the battle internally, like for yourself, you got to own that. But it's not great in the practicals of following Jesus in that you can't love your enemy who's invisible. Do you know what I'm talking about? And Jesus says, no, when you see your enemy who is in flesh, not invisible, you need to go take action and love them. Are you with me right there? Second thing they would say is practice mindfulness, meditation, or positive intentions towards them. It's kind of a grounding and rewiring. Jesus would say, what? Pray for them. Pray for them. And you may be praying, yeah, I got some prayers for them. You know what I'm saying? Don't pray for them like that, right? But pray for them. Prayers of requests and petitions, but maybe prayers of contemplation where you just go, God, I just want to bring before you this person. And I just want you to help me notice what you notice. Help me to see how you see. Help me to show me my heart in this situation. And you just sit with that for a little while. And you let God and you explore that. And then third, conflict resolution. Jesus would say, just simply love them actively. Forgive, be generous, welcome, making room for our enemies. This will take us learning to obey the teachings of Jesus. Do you pray for your enemies? I'm not talking about, again, this is some of us have undergone really significant abusive situations. And this is not making room to stay in those situations. That's not what we're talking about, right? Or to condone, or to rationalize why it's, they're not bad. That's not what we're talking about. But do you pray for your enemies? In whatever situation, whatever spectrum they fall on, would you obey Jesus to pray for them? Would you greet your enemies who just treat you unrighteously? Again, not abusers, but the people in your life that when you go to walk the dog, you hope you don't make eye contact with that neighbor. Do you know what I'm talking about? Some of you are laughing like, yeah, I hope I don't. And if you don't know, you might be that neighbor for somebody else, right? But would you greet them? The teacher at your kid's school who you just grind your teeth every time you see them. Would you greet them? Would you humanize them again? Would you actively love them? Would you invite them into your home for a meal? You can make being a follower of Jesus about many things. Going to heaven, having your sins forgiven, being a member of a great church like this. But Jesus as a follower of him will be someone who actively learns to love like the Father. To mature, to become perfect in this one area specifically. Loving your enemies. As God offered himself in love to reconcile his enemies to himself, you and I, we are called to bear the image of God in the world by doing the same. Who do you need to greet today? Everybody's going to watch out in fellowship. Are you saying hi to me? Right? But maybe there are family members, maybe there are neighbors, maybe there are brothers or sisters or even a spouse. Who do you need to pray for? Who do you need to make room for by actively loving them? I want to tell you about a woman who was active in the civil rights movement at the same time as Martin Luther King Jr., but who's maybe lesser known to some of us in the room, maybe even the younger generation specifically. And her name is Shirley Chisholm. A lot of you guys do know her. She was a congresswoman and a professor, actually right here in the Pioneer Valley at Mount Holyoke. She was a student of Martin Luther King's approach to racial politics, which was obviously an approach informed by the way of Jesus, this non-violent, active love and resistance to one's enemies. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who would say, always fight with love. So this wasn't a passive way. This was an active and subversive way. Every year after his death, Chisholm would give a speech in honor of him, reminding others of the principles that he stood for and the way that those principles employed in a community of people accomplished so much. She would go on to be the first black woman to run for president in 1972. And guess who she ran against? George Wallace of Alabama. In the middle of the campaign, do you know what happened? Some of you guys were alive for this. Someone shot George Wallace and paralyzed him. He would remain that way for the rest of his life. Shirley Chisholm went to go see him in the hospital. To share her concern for him. And this, of course, came at the great displeasure of all of her supporters, right? Anytime you see a Christian forgiving and loving their enemy, you can see a lot of other people around them who are Christians getting upset about it. Nothing makes Christians more angry than Christians loving their enemies. It's true. The congresswoman recounted that she told Wallace, "I wouldn't want what happened to you to happen to anyone." And that the governor cried and cried. Wallace's daughter later recounted this event saying, Shirley Chisholm had the courage to believe that even George Wallace could change. She had faith in him. She planted a seed of new beginnings in my father's heart, a chance to make it right. Both Wallace and Chisholm would lose the election. But in 1979, a few years after this encounter with Chisholm, Wallace entered the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church where Martin Luther King was a preacher. Still paralyzed in his wheelchair, unannounced, he showed up and apologized to the congregation.
Awesome.
He said, "I have learned what suffering means in a way that was impossible before the shooting. I think I can understand something now of the pain black people have come to endure. Wow. And I know that I contributed to that pain, and I can only ask for your forgiveness." The seed that Chisholm had planted through active enemy love, through hosting her enemy, by fighting it with love, had been watered. And God made it grow. Amen. She would say, the church must provide hope and leadership and not become a cloistered setting for escape.
Come on, Shirley.
The church, come on, Shirley. The church is not meant to be this invisible club of those who are awaiting escape from the world someday. It is meant to be a public, active community of love for others, including those who oppose them. Making room for our enemies will require disciples of Jesus to publicly fight with love, to pray for, to greet, to be generous to host those who offend them or even aim to hurt and oppress them. Jesus came to make room for his enemies. We see him with Samaritans and Romans and tax collectors. And in our day, it would be Democrats and Republicans and white and black and Latino and Chickapeans and Longmeadowites and all of them, right? Jesus came advancing the kingdom. I love this. John Mark Comer said this. Jesus came advancing the kingdom one meal at a time. With a group of unlikely people sitting at a table together, hosting each other. Enemies. In loving action. Those who were ethnically, politically, and religiously enemies. Learning each other's stories. Actively humanizing one another. And in doing so, subverting the powers and the rulers of the age. And showing a new way forward. He called it the kingdom of heaven. A new kingdom with a new type of people who would make room and who would always fight with love. Amen.